I wish the whole human race had one neck and I had my hands around it. Those were the words of a man who killed at least 21 people. But here's the thing that'll make your blood run cold. He said that while laughing. His name was Carl Panzram, and by the time I'm done telling you his story, you'll understand why even the most hardened prison guards were afraid to be alone with him. This isn't just another serial killer story. This is the story of a man who turned hatred into a science and wrote a manual on how to destroy human lives because he enjoyed it. Carl Panzram was born in 1891 in rural Minnesota, and from day one, the world seemed determined to break him. His father abandoned the family when Carl was 7. His mother? She dealt with her 5 kids the only way she knew how, with a leather strap and her fists. Picture this. You're 8 years old. You steal an apple from a neighbor's tree because you're hungry. Your punishment? Your mother beats you unconscious with a wooden board, then locks you in the cellar for 3 days. No food, no water, just darkness and the sound of your own crying. By age 11, Carl was already drinking alcohol, not because he was rebellious, because he was trying to numb pain that most adults couldn't handle. His first arrest came that same year. Drunk and disorderly, the judge took one look at this skinny, angry kid and made a decision that would change everything. Reform school, but here's what that judge didn't know. Reform school in 1902 wasn't about reform. It was about punishment. Daily beatings, solitary confinement, guards who treated children like animals. And Carl learned something in that place. He learned that the world was divided into 2 types of people, those who hurt others and those who get hurt. Carl decided he was never going to be the one getting hurt again. At 14, he escaped reform school for the first time. When they dragged him back, he was different. The scared little boy was gone. In his place was something cold, calculating, something that looked at other human beings and saw targets. The guards noticed the change immediately. Carl had stopped crying when they beat him. Instead, he would stare at them with these dead, empty eyes and smile. One guard later said it was like looking at a shark. By 16, Carl had escaped again. This time he didn't just run, he stole a gun, and he had a plan. Not just to survive, but to make sure everyone else suffered as much as he had. Now, before I tell you what Carl did next, I need to warn you, what you're about to hear isn't just disturbing. It's going to make you question everything you thought you knew about human nature. If stories like this shock you, if they make you want to understand how the human mind can become this twisted, then you need to subscribe right now, because what Carl Panzram did over the next 20 years will haunt you, but it'll also teach you something about evil that most people never learn. Hit that subscribe button, because you're going to want to remember this channel when you can't sleep tonight. Carl Panzram's first adult crime wasn't random. It was calculated. He walked into a hardware store in Montana, pointed a gun at the owner and said, "Give me everything in your register, or I'll paint these walls with your blood." The owner handed over $37. But here's the part that shows you how Carl's mind worked. He didn't just take the money and leave. He forced the owner to lie face down on the floor. Then he stood over him for 5 full minutes, just waiting. The owner later told police that those 5 minutes felt like hours. He was sure Carl was going to kill him, but Carl didn't pull the trigger, not because he felt mercy, but because he enjoyed watching the man think he was about to die. Carl later wrote, "I liked the way his body shook. I liked knowing I had complete control over whether he lived or died." This became Carl's signature. He didn't just rob people, he terrorized them. He'd break into houses at night and wake up the families, not to steal anything, just to stand at the foot of their beds and watch them realize someone was there. One family in Colorado described waking up to find Carl sitting in their kitchen. He'd been there for hours, just sitting, eating their food, reading their mail, learning everything about their lives. When the father asked what he wanted, Carl said, "I wanted to see how long it would take you to notice me. Now I know where you work. I know what time your kids walk to school. I know everything about you." Then he left. The family moved 3 states away the next week. Because Carl hadn't stolen anything, he'd stolen something worse. Their sense of safety, their ability to sleep at night, their trust in the world. But Carl was just getting started. Over the next few years, he robbed banks in 11 different states. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the power, the fear in people's eyes, the knowledge that he could end a life with a simple decision. His first murder happened in 1905, a drifter he met while hopping trains. Carl later wrote about it like he was describing what he had for breakfast. "I hit him with a rock while he slept. Then I rolled his body off the train. I felt nothing. Actually, that's not true. I felt satisfied." From there, the killings became more frequent, more creative, more cruel. Carl would befriend lonely people, people who trusted him. Then he would turn that trust into a weapon. In 1907, he met a young man named Thomas at a bar in Seattle. Thomas was new in town, no friends, no family nearby. Carl offered to show him around. They spent 3 days together. Carl learned everything about Thomas, his dreams, his fears, his plans for the future. Then, on the 4th night, Carl led Thomas to a secluded area by the docks and beat him to death with a piece of driftwood. But here's what makes your skin crawl. Carl kept Thomas's wallet, not for the money, for the photos. He would look at pictures of Thomas's family and imagine their faces when they realized he was never coming home. How does a human being become this twisted? How does someone look at another person's happiness and decide to destroy it, just for fun? Carl Panzram wasn't killing for money. He wasn't killing for revenge. He was killing because he enjoyed watching life drain out of people's eyes. By 1915, Carl had killed at least a dozen people. But he was getting bored with simple murder. He wanted to try something new, something that would cause more suffering, more terror. Carl discovered fire, not just as a weapon, but as an art form. He would spend weeks studying buildings, learning who worked there, who lived there, when they came and went. Then he would set fires designed not just to destroy property, but to trap people inside. In 1917, he burned down a lumber warehouse in Oregon. But Carl didn't just light a match and run. He blocked the exits. First, then he sat across the street and watched. 3 men died in that fire. Carl later wrote, "I could hear them screaming. I could see them at the windows trying to break the glass. I've never been happier." This is what separates Carl Panzram from other killers. Most murderers try to distance themselves from their victims' suffering. Carl wanted to experience every second of it. He would study newspapers for days after his crimes, reading about the families of his victims. Their grief became his entertainment. Between 1917 and 1920, Carl went on what he called his grand tour, coast to coast, leaving a trail of bodies and burned buildings. But he wasn't random about it. Carl kept detailed notes, maps, schedules, plans. He approached murder the way other people approach business. Carl had rules for killing. Rule 1, never kill someone who wouldn't be missed. He wanted families to suffer. Rule 2, always make them afraid before they die. Fear, he said, was the most honest human emotion. Rule 3, never feel guilty. Guilt, according to Carl, was for weak people. In 1918, Carl committed what he later called his masterpiece. He befriended an entire family in Kansas, the Hendersons. Father, mother, 2 young children. Carl showed up at their farm, claiming to be a traveling preacher. They invited him to stay for dinner. That dinner lasted 3 days. Carl charmed the family completely. He played with the children, helped with farm work, even said grace at meals. The Hendersons thought he was a gift from God. On the 3rd night, Carl waited until the family was asleep. Then he barricaded all the doors from the outside and set the house on fire. But Carl didn't leave. He sat on the porch and listened, first to the smoke alarms, then to the family waking up, then to their panic, as they realized they were trapped, then to their screams. Carl later wrote, "I listened to each voice until it stopped. The children's voices were the last to go quiet. That was my favorite part. 4 people. A family who had shown him nothing but kindness. And Carl burned them alive because he was curious what it would sound like. What kind of person does that? What kind of mind even conceives of such a thing? By 1928, Carl Panzram had killed 21 people, maybe more. He'd burned down dozens of buildings, robbed hundreds of victims, and he'd never been caught for any of it. But Carl was getting older, and he was getting careless, not because he was losing his edge, but because he was getting bored. Carl walked into a jewelry store in Baltimore. It should have been a simple robbery, but when the owner handed over the money, Carl made a mistake. He started talking. Carl told the jeweler, "You know, I've robbed places like this all over the country, from California to New York." The jeweler nodded, just trying to stay alive, but Carl kept going. "I bet I've stolen more money than any man alive. I bet I've killed more people too." The jeweler later told police that Carl seemed proud of it, like he was bragging about a golf score. When Carl left the store, the jeweler immediately called the police. Not just about the robbery, about the confession. Carl was arrested 3 blocks away, still carrying the stolen jewel, still talking about his crimes. When the police sat Carl down for questioning, they expected him to deny everything, maybe ask for a lawyer, maybe claim insanity. Instead, Carl smiled and said, "How much time do you have? Because I've got a lot to tell you." For the next 18 hours, Carl confessed to everything, not because he felt guilty, not because he wanted to help the families find closure, but because he was proud of what he'd done. He described each murder in detail. He drew maps showing where bodies were buried. He even corrected the police when they got facts wrong. Detective James Morrison, who conducted the interview, later said, "I've questioned hundreds of criminals. They all make excuses. They blame their childhood or drugs or desperation. Carl Panzram didn't make excuses. He bragged." But Carl wasn't done confessing. In prison, he began writing his autobiography. 1,000 words, every crime, every victim, every moment of violence, written with the enthusiasm of someone describing their favorite vacation. "I have murdered 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I have committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all of this, I am not the least bit sorry. I have no conscience, so that does not worry me. I believe the only way to reform people is to kill them." Carl's autobiography wasn't just a confession. It was a manifesto, a guide to hating humanity. He wrote, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing." Prison psychiatrists examined Carl for months. They were looking for signs of mental illness, something to explain his behavior. Instead, they found something much more terrifying. Carl Panzram was completely sane. He knew right from wrong. He just didn't care. Dr. Karl Menninger, one of the most famous psychiatrists of the era, interviewed Carl personally. His conclusion, Carl Panzram is not insane. He is evil. Pure, conscious, deliberate evil. Carl's response when told this, "Finally someone who understands me." Carl Panzram was sentenced to death. Most prisoners on death row spend their final months writing letters to family, seeking forgiveness, finding God. Carl spent his time writing more confessions and planning one final murder, even on death row. Carl wasn't done killing. He befriended Robert Webster, a prison guard who had shown him small kindnesses. Webster would sneak Carl extra food. Sometimes they'd talk for hours. Webster thought he was seeing Carl's humanity. Carl was just studying his next victim. On June 20th, 1930, Carl asked Webster to come to his cell. He said he had something important to tell him, something about hidden money from his robberies. Webster, curious and trusting, came close to the bars. Carl reached through and strangled him with his bare hands. When asked why he killed the one person who had been kind to him, Carl said, "I wanted to kill someone before I died." Webster was just convenient. No rage, no emotion, just cold, practical evil. Carl's execution was scheduled for September 5th, 1930. As the date approached, people expected him to show some fear, some regret, some humanity. Instead, Carl complained that the execution was taking too long. Carl spent his last weeks writing letters to newspapers, not asking for mercy, demanding faster execution. He wrote to the warden, "I wish you would hurry up and get this hanging business over with. I'm getting tired of waiting." On the morning of his execution, Carl Panzram walked to the gallows without assistance, no chaplain, no final prayer, no last words of remorse. The executioner asked if he had any final statement. Carl looked at the crowd of witnesses and said, "Hurry it up, you bastard! I could kill 10 people while you're fooling around." Those were his last words. No plea for forgiveness, no expression of regret, just irritation that his death was taking too long. Carl Panzram died the same way he lived, angry at the world, completely, unrepentant, and somehow satisfied. After Carl's death, prison officials found something in his cell that no one expected. A detailed plan for escaping death row, not to avoid execution, but to kill more people. Even facing death, Carl Panzram was planning his next murder. So what do you do with a story like Carl Panzram's? How do you process the existence of someone so completely evil? Was Carl born this way? Was it his childhood trauma, or did he simply choose to be a monster? The truth is, probably all three, and that's what makes his story so terrifying. I want you to imagine something for a moment. Imagine you're walking down a dark street at night, and you see someone sitting on a bench, just sitting there, watching. People walk by. How would you know if that person was Carl Panzram? The answer is, you wouldn't. Carl looked like a normal person. He could be charming when he wanted to be. He could make you trust him. And that's what makes people like Carl so dangerous. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just sits quietly and waits. Carl Panzram's case changed how we understand criminal psychology. Before Carl, people believed that everyone had some good in them, that with enough help, anyone could be rehabilitated. Carl proved that some people are beyond help. Some people don't want to be saved. What would you have done if you were the judge who sentenced 11-year-old Carl to reform school? What if you were the guard who Carl befriended, then murdered? What if you were on the jury that had to decide his fate? Carl Panzram suffered terrible abuse as a child, but so do millions of other people, and they don't become serial killers. So at what point does explanation become excuse? At what point do we stop trying to understand evil and just accept that some people choose it? Carl Panzram died over 90 years ago, but his autobiography is still studied today, not to glorify him, but to understand how a human being can become so completely inhuman. His story serves as a reminder: evil is real. It walks among us, and sometimes it's smiling. Carl Panzram wanted to be remembered. He wanted his hatred to outlive him. In some ways, he succeeded. But maybe that's not entirely bad, because remembering people like Carl Panzram helps us recognize the warning signs. It helps us protect the innocent, and it reminds us why we lock our doors at night. If this story has affected you, if it's made you think about the nature of evil and human psychology, then subscribe for more deep dives into the criminal mind, because understanding darkness is the first step to preventing it. And Carl Panzram's story, as disturbing as it is, has something to teach us about the depths human beings can sink to and maybe, just maybe, how to stop them before they get there.